It was supposed to be a respite from the stifling heat of the city, an escape to the old lakeside cabin that had been in Ellie's family for generations. The group of friends, 4 in total, had been planning this getaway since the depths of winter's chill. Ellie, Josh, Tara, and Chris were eager to exchange the concrete jungle for the dense, whispering woods of Hemlock Hollow. The drive to the cabin was a mix of excitement and nostalgia. Old rock songs blared through the speakers as they wound through the serpentine mountain roads. The higher they climbed, the denser the fog became, swallowing the trees and the path in front of them. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled, and the lake mirrored the twilight sky, a sheet of glass untouched by the wind. "Wow, it's creepier than I remembered," Ellie remarked, her voice tinged with unease as they unloaded the car. The cabin, an aged structure of wood and stone, stood against the backdrop of the darkening forest. It seemed to sag under the weight of countless winters, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the gloom. As they approached, the door creaked open slightly, as if ushered by an unseen hand. "It's just the wind," Josh joked, though his laugh sounded hollow. They spent the first night rekindling old friendships around a crackling fire, reminiscing about past adventures and sharing stories of their lives apart. But as the fire died down and the shadows grew longer, an uneasy silence fell over the group. "Did you guys hear that?" Chris whispered suddenly. "Hear what?" Tara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sounds like footsteps outside," Chris replied, straining his ears. Josh grabbed a flashlight and swung open the door, the beam cutting through the blackness. "There's nothing out there," he said after a moment, though his voice lacked conviction. They locked the doors and retreated to their rooms, the sound of their own breaths loud in the quiet of the night. But sleep was elusive. Ellie lay awake, listening to the wind howl and the cabin groan under its force. It wasn't until late into the night that she finally drifted off, only to be awakened by a nightmare of shadowy figures whispering at the foot of her bed. The next morning, the air was charged with tension. None of them mentioned the sounds from the night before, choosing instead to focus on the day ahead. They decided to explore the woods, hoping the daylight would restore the sense of peace they sought. As they wandered deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, the light dimming with each step. It was Tara who first noticed the oddities, small, handmade dolls pinned to the trunks of the trees, their tiny faces twisted in grotesque expressions. "What the hell is this?" she exclaimed, her voice echoing off the trees. "It's probably just a prank from the last people here," Josh suggested, but his attempt at reassurance fell flat. They continued on, but with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets they couldn't understand. When they came across a clearing, the sight before them stole their breath. A circle of stones lay in the center, charred remnants of what looked like bones scattered within. "This isn't right," Chris said, backing away. "We should go back." They turned to leave but found their path blocked by an old woman, her eyes milky white, her skin as pale as the fog. "You shouldn't have come here," she rasped, pointing a gnarled finger at them. "Who are you?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. "The guardian of this place," the woman replied. "The spirits you've awoken are not kind." As they hurried back to the cabin, the sounds of the forest seemed to chase them, an amalgam of whispers and cries that didn't cease even when they slammed the cabin door shut behind them. That night, as darkness enveloped the world, the real terror began. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and the whispers turned into screams. As fear tightened its grip, Ellie found an old journal tucked away in a drawer. The pages, yellowed with age, contained the ramblings of a madman, tales of rituals and sacrifices made to appease the spirits of the forest. They demand one more, the last entry read, dated exactly 50 years ago to the day. The power went out, plunging them into darkness. The last thing Ellie saw before the screams began was the silhouette of the old woman, her figure merging with the shadows, her voice a whisper in the dark, "It is time." The terror that night was palpable, as one by one, they were drawn into the nightmare. Ellie could hear her friends' panicked breaths, the shuffle of footsteps, their desperate whispers. She clung to the journal, its pages now her only link to understanding the nightmare unfolding around them. Tara's scream pierced the air, a sound so filled with terror that it chilled Ellie to the bone. The cabin seemed to close in on them, the walls themselves groaning with ancient secrets. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying with it the faint, yet unmistakable scent of decay. Shadows danced across the walls, twisted and elongated, morphing into grotesque shapes that defied the laws of nature. Ellie, Josh, Chris, and Tara huddled together in the living room, the flashlights being their only source of light. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive, its eerie chorus of sounds growing louder, more insistent. The old woman's words echoed in Ellie's mind, a constant, chilling reminder, the spirits you've awoken are not kind. As hours ticked by, their situation grew increasingly dire. The cabin's temperature dropped, breaths turning visible in the air, a frosty mist enveloping everything. The walls creaked ominously, as if bending to the will of the forest outside. "I read about this in the journal," Ellie whispered, her voice shaky as she flipped through the pages. "The cabin and the forest, they're cursed. Every 50 years, the spirits demand a sacrifice. They feed on fear." The flashlight flickered, casting their shadows against the wall, elongated and distorted. Just then, a loud bang sounded from the roof, as if something, or someone, had landed heavily on it. They jumped, eyes wide with fright, as a series of thumps trailed across the ceiling, moving toward the back of the cabin. "What was that?" Tara gasped, her voice a mix of fear and disbelief. "Something's on the roof," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, its light now their only barrier against the encroaching darkness. The thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a scratching sound, like nails on wood, dragging slowly and deliberately. It was a sound that spoke of intent, a purposeful, menacing rhythm. Without warning, the front door shook violently, as if struck by an immense force. The wind screamed through the gaps, its howl a sinister symphony with the cracking wood. The door's old hinges groaned under the assault, and with a final, agonizing creak, it flew open, slamming against the wall. The cold burst into the cabin like a living thing, its icy fingers clawing at their skin. Through the open door, the forest was a black void, a gaping maw waiting to swallow them whole. They retreated from the entrance, backing away as the cold pursued them, relentless and unforgiving. Then, as suddenly as it had opened, the door slammed shut, cutting off the howl of the wind. The cabin plunged into silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that weighed on them like a shroud. They stood frozen, breaths held, hearts pounding. "It's playing with us," Josh said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Whatever it is, it's playing with us." The flashlight flickered again, then died, leaving them in utter darkness. Panic set in, a visceral, clawing panic that threatened to tear them apart. They clung to each other, their breaths quick and shallow, as the darkness seemed to press in on them, tangible and alive. From the shadows, a low, mournful wail began to rise, a sound so full of sorrow and pain that it tugged at their hearts. It was a cry that spoke of endless grief, of unquenchable anger and despair. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the cabin, echoing off the walls and seeping into their very bones. They could hear footsteps now, a slow, measured tread coming from the back of the cabin. Each step was deliberate, heavy with the weight of impending doom. The footsteps drew nearer, the sound growing louder, more pronounced. Ellie's heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She remembered the last line she had read in the journal, the warning that had been passed down through generations, yet never fully believed. They demand one more. The footsteps stopped, just outside the small circle of their huddled bodies. The cold enveloped them, a chilling embrace that promised no escape. And in the suffocating blackness of the cabin, a voice whispered, a voice that was not one but many, a chorus of the damned. Who will it be? The question hung in the air, heavy with the promise of horror yet to come. The shadows seemed to pulsate with anticipation, waiting for their answer, for their fear to ripen into terror. And as the cabin creaked ominously around them, the dark side of summer vacation had only just begun. The whisper dissolved into the dark, thick air of the cabin, each syllable a chilling caress against their ears. The oppressive silence returned, suffocating in its intensity, broken only by the rapid, shallow breaths of the four terrified friends. Outside, the wind continued to moan, a lament for souls lost in these woods, echoing through the trees like a warning. Tara clutched at Ellie's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "We need to leave," she hissed, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out now." But the cabin felt surrounded, the forest a living barrier of malice. The notion of stepping outside seemed as deadly as staying within the wooden walls that now felt more like a trap than shelter. Chris nodded, a silent agreement with Tara's panicked plan. "Let's make a break for the car. It's our only chance," he urged, his voice low and urgent. Josh shook his head, his eyes wide with the terror of rational thought amidst the irrational. "And if we open that door, what then? We let whatever is out there come in." "No," Ellie interjected, her voice steadier than she felt. Her eyes were glued to the window, peering into the pitch black that pressed against the glass. "We need a plan. We can't just run blindly." They huddled closer, whispering fiercely, every creak and moan of the cabin amplifying their fear. Outside, the chorus of the forest grew louder, the wails and whispers intertwining into a symphony of threats. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cabin as something heavy struck the back wall. The building itself seemed to shudder under the impact, dust falling from the ceiling beams. Screams erupted from the group, high and sharp in the dead air. "What is that?" Tara cried out, her voice trembling with fear. "It's trying to get in," Chris said, his eyes darting around, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. They scoured the room frantically, finding only the fireplace pokers and a few old tools, a hammer and a couple of screwdrivers. Gripping these meager weapons, they positioned themselves, backs to each other, facing outwards towards the walls of the cabin. The thumping continued, now joined by a scraping sound, like claws on wood. It circled the cabin, random and unpredictable. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, thicker, heavier, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Then the real terror began. From the shadows of the corners of the room, figures began to materialize. Not solid, but made of mist and darkness, their forms vague and shifting. Eyes, hollow and soulless, gleamed in the dimness, fixed on the terrified group. The figures moved slowly, deliberately, their feet barely touching the ground, leaving no sound in their wake. Ellie felt the cold seep into her bones, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to freeze her from the inside out. Her breath came out in visible puffs, the air around her frosting. "We need to do something," Josh said, his voice cracking with fear. "What can we do against this?" Tara's reply was a whisper of despair. The figures drew closer, encircling them. A cacophony of whispers filled the room, each word a thread in a tapestry of madness. The temperature dropped further, the colder physical weight on their shoulders. "Stay together," Ellie managed to choke out, her eyes fixed on the approaching shadows. "Whatever happens, stay together." As the figures converged, the air thickened, becoming almost tangible in its oppressiveness. It was then that the cabin's old grandfather clock began to chime, though it had been silent for years. Each toll resonated through the room, syncing with the beating of their terrified hearts. With each chime, the figures paused, as if the sound held power over them. The group watched, breaths held, as the clock counted down the hour. On the 12th toll, the figures vanished, the room suddenly empty except for the echo of the last chime. Relief flooded through them momentarily, until they realized the respite might be temporary. The forest's cries hadn't ceased, if anything, they had grown in intensity. The cabin no longer felt like sanctuary but a tomb, a holding cell at the mercy of whatever controlled the woods. Chris turned to the others, his face pale under the strain of terror. "We're not safe here. We'll never be safe here," he whispered. "We have to leave. Now." Gathering their courage, they agreed to make a run for the car. The plan was desperate, but so was their situation. They moved towards the door, every muscle tensed for action, every nerve alight with adrenaline. Ellie placed her hand on the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her flesh as if warning her of the danger beyond. She turned back to her friends, her eyes seeking confirmation, reassurance. They nodded, their faces set in grim determination. With a deep breath, she twisted the knob, the door creaking ominously as it swung open. A rush of cold, damp air greeted them, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. The forest loomed before them, trees swaying as if in silent mockery of their plight. They stepped out, their movements cautious, their senses heightened to every sound, every shadow. Their path to the car was shrouded in darkness, the night devoid of moon or stars, as if the sky itself had turned its back on them. The only light came from the feeble beam of Chris's flashlight, flickering uncertainly as if it too feared the dark. They moved as one, their steps hurried yet silent, aware that every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves might betray them to whatever horrors lurked in the shadows. The trees seemed to close in around them, branches reaching out like twisted hands, leaves whispering secrets in a language of fear. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the forest, a sound so primal and terrifying it froze them in their tracks. The growl grew into a snarl, then a series of guttural clicks and whispers that surrounded them, closing in from all directions. "Keep moving," Josh hissed, pushing forward, his body tense. They picked up their pace, hearts pounding in their chests, breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Their car was now in sight, a dim silhouette under the shadow of the trees, but it might as well have been miles away. As they neared the vehicle, a figure stepped out from behind a tree, its form shrouded in darkness. It stood still, watching them, its presence menacing. The flashlight's beam trembled as Chris aimed it towards the figure, revealing not a man, but a creature of nightmares. It was tall, its skin pale and mottled, stretched tight over sharp bones. Its eyes were hollow pits of darkness, and its mouth was a wide, gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. Long, clawed fingers hung at its sides, twitching with anticipation. The creature hissed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines, and took a step forward. "Run!" Tara screamed, breaking the paralysis that had gripped them. They sprinted the last few yards to the car, their panic lending speed to their limbs. Ellie reached the driver's side first, fumbling with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The doors unlocked with a loud click, and they piled in, slamming the doors shut behind them. Ellie turned the key in the ignition, her prayers silent but fervent. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, the sound a symphony to their ears. She put the car in gear and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before gaining traction. The creature lunged at the car, its claws scraping against the metal, leaving deep gouges in the paint. They could hear its shrieks of rage as they sped away, the cabin and the horrors it contained disappearing into the night behind them. But as they drove, the winding roads seemed unfamiliar, the landmarks foreign. The forest refused to relinquish its hold, the trees blurring past like specters in the night. "We should have hit the main road by now," Chris said, his voice tense. "Something's wrong." They drove in silence, each turn taking them deeper into the labyrinth of the forest. The realization dawned slowly, a growing horror that clenched at their guts. "We're lost," Tara whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. "The forest, it won't let us leave." The roads twisted and turned, an endless maze with no exit, no escape. The darkness seemed to press in on them, suffocating, relentless. The car's headlights pierced the night, but the path remained elusive, hidden. And then, as suddenly as they had found themselves lost, the road opened up onto a clearing they recognized, the lake, shimmering under the starless sky, the cabin visible on the far shore, its windows dark, foreboding. They had come full circle, back to the beginning, back to the nightmare. Ellie's hands trembled on the steering wheel, the realization settling like ice in her stomach. They were trapped, the cabin and the forest claiming them, unwilling to release their prey. The night was far from over, and as they sat by the lake, the car idling, the sounds of the forest grew louder, more daring. Whispers turned to moans, moans to screams. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of the headlights, circling, watching. The dark side of summer vacation had ensnared them, a story with no end, a horror that refused to climax, spiraling deeper into dread. The realization that escape was but an illusion sank into their bones like the cold. They were puppets in a grotesque play directed by the forest and its unseen masters. Ellie turned the car off, the fuel was low, the futile attempts at escape having drained the tank nearly dry. The silence that followed the engine's death was complete, oppressive, filled with the weight of their despair. Maybe if we face it, confront whatever this is, we can find a way to break free, Josh suggested, his voice a blend of desperation and resolve. They knew they couldn't stay in the car. The feeling of being watched had intensified, the shadows at the edge of the clearing growing denser, their movements more pronounced. Whispers flowed across the water, a cacophony of voices that promised madness. With a collective breath to steel themselves, they opened the car doors and stepped out into the chilling night air. The ground was damp beneath their feet, the grass slick with dew. The lake reflected the black sky, a mirror to the void above. They walked toward the cabin, the structure now seemingly different, more menacing. The wood creaked with the memory of decades, the windows reflecting back their flashlight beams with nothing but darkness inside. As they approached the porch, the air grew colder, the atmosphere charged with static. Each step was an effort, as if the ground itself resisted their approach. When they reached the door, it swung open silently, inviting them into the darkness within. They entered, the flashlight's beam slicing through the thick dust that danced in the air. The furniture was upturned, the remnants of their earlier visit scattered as if in the wake of a storm. The walls seemed to pulse slightly, breathing in time with the whispers that were now screams in their ears. "This is it," Tara said, her voice quivering. "Whatever is happening, it's centered here." They moved through the cabin, coming at last to the room where Ellie had found the journal. It lay open on the floor as if waiting for them, its pages fluttering as though in a breeze, though no wind blew inside the cabin. Ellie picked it up, her hands trembling. The entry she had read before, about the sacrifices and the spirits, now continued, words appearing on the page as if written by an unseen hand. To break the cycle, one must willingly offer themselves to the forest, to appease the spirits once and for all, she read aloud, her voice breaking. Silence followed her words, heavy and expectant. The shadows seemed to lean closer, their presence oppressive. Is that it? One of us? Chris couldn't finish, his implication hanging in the air. They looked at each other, the decision unspoken but understood. The weight of it crushed their spirits, the unfairness, the horror. Yet, amidst the despair, there was a determination, a resolve that had not been there before. It should be me, Ellie said finally, her voice steady. This is my family's cabin, my legacy. Maybe it's my responsibility to end this. No? Josh protested, but Ellie shook her head. It makes sense, she insisted. This has to stop. With a heavy heart, they agreed, none of them able to look her in the eyes as she prepared to walk into the forest alone. The night seemed to pause, the air still, the forest holding its breath. Ellie walked to the edge of the clearing, her silhouette bathed in the pale light of the flashlight, her shadow long and distorted. She turned back once, a sad smile on her lips, then stepped into the darkness, the shadows eagerly closing around her. The screams that night were chilling, filled with both despair and relief, echoing across the lake, reverberating through the trees. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The others waited, the night dragging on, the air slowly warming as if the forest itself was exhaling, releasing a long-held breath. As dawn broke, the sun's rays piercing the darkness, the forest seemed ordinary, the cabin just an old building. But the darkness of that summer vacation would linger in their hearts, the memory of Ellie, their brave friend, a constant shadow at the edge of their joy. As they left the cabin behind, the story seemed to close, yet the whispers of the forest suggested it was merely a pause, a breath in the never-ending cycle of Hemicolo's dark legacy, waiting for the next unwary travelers to discover its secrets. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, the remaining three, Josh, Tara, and Chris, stood at the edge of the clearing. The air was lighter now, the oppressive dread that had smothered them through the night gradually lifting. They were free, or so it seemed, but the price of their freedom was etched deeply in their hearts. Their drive back to civilization was silent, each lost in their own thoughts, their minds replaying the horrors of the night. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, but its shadow lingered, a dark stain on their memories. In the weeks that followed, their lives attempted to return to normalcy, but the echoes of that night haunted them. They spoke little of what had occurred, even to each other, as if mentioning it might invoke the darkness once again. But silence could not erase the truth of what they had experienced. Josh found himself driving back to Hemlock Hollow. The pull of the forest was irresistible, a morbid need to understand, to find closure. As he walked through the now peaceful woods, the sunlight dappling the ground, it all seemed like a distant nightmare. He reached the clearing, half expecting the cabin to have vanished, a figment of their collective terror. But there it stood, benign under the afternoon sun, its windows dusty but mundane. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the gentle breeze. A shiver ran down his spine as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The cabin was exactly as they had left it, frozen in time. As he wandered through the rooms, memories flooded back, each one sharp and vivid. He reached the room where Ellie had found the journal, half expecting to see it still lying there. But it was gone, perhaps reclaimed by the cabin or the forest as its own. On the floor, where the journal had been, was a small pile of fresh wildflowers, their petals bright against the dusty floorboards. Josh knelt, touching them gently, a sense of peace washing over him. It was a peace that spoke of acceptance, of sacrifices made and accepted. Outside, he wandered to the edge of the lake, looking out over the water that had mirrored their terror. The reflection now was of the sky, clouds drifting lazily. It was beautiful, serene, and yet as he watched, a ripple disturbed the water's surface, a single ripple, as if something had just submerged. The air around him filled with whispers, not menacing now, but melancholic, almost grateful. "Thank you," they seemed to say, a susurrus of relief that rustled the leaves and caressed his face. Josh stood there for a long time, listening to the whispers, the weight of guilt and grief gradually lifting from his shoulders. When he finally turned to leave, he looked back once more. The forest stood silent, the cabin a lone sentinel on the landscape, its dark history sealed behind doors of perception and reality. The drive back home was different. The weight of the story, the horror, the sacrifice, felt like it had been left behind, confined to the shadows of the forest where it belonged. But the memory of Ellie, brave and selfless, remained. Her act had broken the cycle, had given them a chance to move forward. Years passed, and life moved on. Josh, Tara, and Chris remained close, bound by the shared ordeal. They never returned to Hammock Hollow, but sometimes, in the stillness of the night, they would hear a whisper on the wind, a gentle reminder of the price of their freedom and the friend who had paid it. And in Hemlock Hollow, the cabin stood unchanged, a monument to the unknown and the unknowable. Travelers passing by might catch a glimpse of it, nestled there in the clearing by the lake, and feel a chill, a sense of something lingering, something watching. So the story of that dark summer vacation lived on, whispered in the rustling leaves, murmured in the ripple of the waters, a tale of terror, of sacrifice, and ultimately, of redemption, forever etched in the annals of the forest's dark heart.